I mean, I will say it's just it's bringing me to mind right now is that somebody's water did break in Satellite.
Yeah.
Really?
Somebody was in there and she was just having a real profound experience and was like relaxed enough that her water.
It was our opening night of Satellite.
Opening night.
And she's like, I need to go to the hospital.
And she had a beautiful baby within like 8 hours later.
And her husband like set up all these nice lights. He
was so inspired by the lights.
Yeah, he got all these like nice colored LEDs for the hospital room.
That is going to be the trippiest baby ever. Why don't you brothers tell us about how you created Chromasonic?
Good story, good question. I am a practicing artist, multimedia installation artist, and have been very much interested in the nature of perception in general, and have had a running practice for the majority of my grown life. And a few years back, we had the good fortune where maybe those interstitial spaces we talked about earlier kind of closed the gap through a mutual friend of ours, actually, of Orpheo's and mine, who's a scientist or former scientist at Professor Caltech, who then wound up teaching in Ojai astronomy. He introduced us because he found out about the interest of Orpheo and some of the other founding artists, actually, of Chromasonic, that we shared some interests, and some of this interest crossed over into how I was practicing art along with my partner Harriet. And
what kind of art were you doing at the time?
What are the interests? Yeah.
Oh, the interests. Roughly speaking, or specifically speaking, it's really around connecting light and matter, sort of the physical and the immaterial.
Very cool.
And orchestrating those in ways in physical space, but also through technology and algorithms to enhance and expand your perception, to feel yourself in a new way or in a different way, but fundamentally around light and sound, actually.
What sparked this?
The origin comes from how we make a picture, and how we make pictures is how we begin to see ourselves, right? So we live in a world right now that is laden with imagery, more so than at any other time in history, really, right? I was a passionate drawer as a kid. I was a super quiet kid, and I always gravitated towards drawing and observing and drawing what was around me. And lots of artist friends in my parents' circle, so I hung out in studios most of the time as a kid growing up, and discovered that some of these artists, they were working with abstraction, so image but deconstructed. And so I very early on started to work when I was drawing and kind of deconstructing what I was seeing, and realized that when I was making an image, when you deconstruct the image and you abstract it, then all of a sudden you are in the presence of something that's really right there, and that informs you in a very different way than a picture does. Then this relationship becomes about you and that instance of what you're seeing, and so it becomes much more self-reflective. The path has been around kind of the deconstruction of the image, ultimately to give the viewers or the participants or the people that come across the work to have an opportunity to have their own image making happening from a stimulus of the art.
Okay, we should define. So we've actually had the pleasure and the honor of working with your technology. And
in Venice.
Yeah, and we were introduced to your technology as essentially from our mutual friends, and they were like, because we've been working on an interactive space for Acid for Squares, and they were like, we know the literal people creating acid like for squares using technology and sound and frequency and light. So when we went to your installation, I mean, it was like walking onto like a Kubrick set, like something like 2001: A Space Odyssey. And we laid down, and there were all these colors and frequencies being played, and it was very much like a psychedelic experience. And we left in a state of tranquility and bliss. And, we sort of stepped into your office. This is the first time we met to have a conversation. And you all looked at us and were like, oh yeah, that was like the low setting. That was the low setting.
We could have turned it all the way up, but for your first time.
We were just working on a high setting this afternoon, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yes.
Was that your intention going into creating this work, that you were going to essentially create an interactive space where you can put people in altered states of consciousness and give them a transcendental experience with no hallucinogens or anything of the sort?
Yes, I think very much. And just to go back into the origin story of how Chromasonic began. So Johannes had been doing this work in exploring, as he was saying, color and different mediums, connecting material and color, as you would say. Mm-hmm. Joel Shearer, who's another founding artist in Chromasonic, and myself come from sound background, and had years as touring musicians, and we really got interested in creating environments where you remove the performer from the experience, and in this kind of environment you allow for a narrative to not be projected onto the experience. So
we kind of went. We were kind of, by our mutual friend, the scientist. We were kind of sent on a blind date. It literally. Ojai. Like, you guys should meet. And so I go up to Ojai, which I've been there a million times. Lived there for 4 years, and we met in a coffee shop. And
and Joel and I were interested in exploring converting sound into light in an immersive kind of space. And so I was sharing this with our mutual friend. And he shared that Johannes had been working in creating these beautiful immersive environments where he was converting light into sound.
Wild.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting on that first meeting, actually. Obviously, they were like super nice guys, it was like really cool. And they played me some of the sound that they were working with, not so much of the work that you were doing as, touring the globe, but rather some of the ambient work. And I listened to this little tape thing, and I was feeling in my head this sort of like calm come upon me. And it was this similar sensation just listening to the sounds that they were creating to what was happening in the sculptures that I was creating. It's like, oh, this really affects you in a really profound sort of way. And then the other thing that was really interesting was that what Orpheo was talking about before was that they were interested in removing the performer, and coming from performing artists narrating something that they wanted to remove the performer. That really piqued my interest, because it basically moves the intention of the space of the work into a space where, as an artist, basically as a visual artist, let's say, you are always extracting yourself from the work itself, so that the work is just there for itself, and it's not about the performance, not about the artist, actually. And so that was really, really interesting. I thought that there's some really interesting nexus that we should talk more. Yeah. And I also found that what was really kind of an interesting moment at that point in time was coming from a space where the space that Orpheo and Joel come out of, from the world of music, ultimately, that transformed the world in the last century so profoundly, and that can create access and to a much broader public than the arts necessarily can or do at the moment. And so I felt like this was a really interesting, and I think we kind of agreed on that, there's a really interesting opportunity here to create a project specifically that kind of goes with the flow, with the power of the arts, of the power of art at this very fundamental level, much like their work with sound, so fundamental and so minimal, and combining that with the interest that they had in converting it to light, our work with light to sound. And we all knew that all of the work that we do does change people. It just changes people when they're in the presence of it. And so that was sort of the seed moment.
Oh my God. So, so many questions.
I do want to say something, because the removing of the artist or the performer is such a cool thing, because when we went to Chromasonic, your installation in Venice Beach, so basically this thing looks like an egg spaceship.
Actually, it looks like a toroidal field. I mean, literally.
Oh yeah, because it does in the center. It has the light.
Yes.
Yeah. But the cool thing about it is that they have these seats set around, and they give you a white blanket to cover yourself in, because everything is completely white. So you completely lose sense of yourself and anybody else and the space around you. And then the lights start changing, and then the music comes in, and there's a lot of like these deep hums, and it's just overwhelming almost. It's like your body you're like, I can't handle this. And then it goes away and changes. You're like, okay, I'm back. But it's really an incredible experience because you do lose yourself and it all like creates like hallucinations.
Yeah. And that's the thing is, right. We were psychonauts. We practice altered states of consciousness, whether it's with a medicine or it's, breath work or meditation or sensory deprivation, so on and so forth. Those states of consciousness, especially on the most peripheral level, are really like, the experience you have, our colors sort of moving in and out. It is non-physical, it's non-corporeal, it's transcendent of sort of like physical totems or symbols. And it 100% put us in that state of consciousness. But another like really cool thing is focusing on removing the performer is really interesting because there's this age-old problem as long as recorded history where you essentially have this artist, this shaman, this priest, whatever, who's essentially pointing up to heaven or to a higher state of consciousness and communicating a message, and people have the emotional experience of the message, but they essentially transpose it onto the individual and they get stuck on the individual, and it creates this hierarchy which is a distortion of looking up as someone greater than you, or they have the message, as opposed to realizing that no, there is a non-physical space where you are connecting to and having this emotionally transcendent experience. And that is sort of the pathway to that you're walking down or being pulled into. But as soon as you think it's somebody, it's the artist, you get stuck in this false dichotomy. Yeah. So we talk about it all the time of how do you transcend that distortion, and this is very fascinating. To hear you two talk about it. So is that when you say remove the performer? Is that what you're looking to get past to move people beyond the performer and into the actual, I guess, whatever the energy the art is connecting you to?
Yeah, and kind of removing narrative as well, just allowing people to be in the presence of pure sound and pure color. We all have an intimate relationship with both these mediums, and they're surrounding us, they're a part of us, they're a part of our everyday life. And when you can remove a narrative and even physical form with this relationship, it immediately allows us to go into these deeper states of presence.
Can you talk about like the obstruction of narrative? Because we talk a lot about being post-narrative. We're in this interesting time with the ubiquity of information, with the internet. There's all these different point of views and stories that clash with each other. People seem to have trouble holding two truths in one hand, but we always say we're post-narrative. It's an interesting thing. We all have our stories and we want to perpetuate our stories because our ego and identity are attached to it, but it can be, very problematic. It's one of the reasons we've become sort of disillusioned by the film medium, which is what we grow up in, where we just feel like at a certain point, it can only take you so far, before you just start adding that story to your own narrative or using it to define your own narrative. Like, can you speak to a little bit to the why it's important to make art that is post-narrative?
We live in an age, I would say, information inflation. It's all, deliberately designed to grab your attention, right? By nature of that, which is very much by design, we have become very challenged to really be able to connect to ourselves in sort of really meaningful ways. That's the big challenge. I think that's also one of the reasons we have such a high incidence of mental health challenges in our culture and our society in general. Creating a place and space where the entire DNA is built around removing the narrative, creating formless space, removing image, and removing representation. So representation, an image, is a representation of something else. Once you remove that image, in the way we express spaces, these spaces come in very specific types of geometries that allow very specific light situations and also very specific sound situations to happen. There is no physical information in that space anymore, where our perceptual system, so the way we're built to navigate in the physical world, which is, we're creating our own image here as we speak. Each one of us is creating our own reality here, right? We remove all of that information that we need to process, living in the physical world. And when we remove that, our brain, our senses begin to fill in and start to create their own images, right? And that's hence the hallucination that actually begins to happen. These spaces become spaces about imagination. So it's about image making, but inside you, as opposed to image making that's presented to you. And that gives agency to the participant to kind of reconnect with themselves in terms of how they define and create reality, how they see themselves themselves, how they see others. And then there's also, of course, all the other sort of sensory aspects about that we can talk about, in terms of how light affects us, sound affects us, and those things. But it's primarily really around, just to close that kind of idea around image, representation, narrative, ultimately dogma as well, right? It's a very pure space that's really serves the visitors and participants that are coming in, for them to really profoundly be able to connect to themselves.
So speaking of Chromasonic and the participants, can you talk a little bit about what you are, because when we walked in, you write down, you're like, how are you feeling before you walk in? How do you feel afterwards? Which is such a cool thing. I didn't really know what to expect from it, but it definitely changed and altered my day. So can you speak a little bit about what your understanding is, what people are getting out of this?
Yeah, so I'll maybe just talk quickly about why we're doing that. And so another founding partner, Harriet, my creative partner and partner in life, she also studied brain science and clinical psychology and art, and we make art together as well. What we wanted to create, and also in early conversation with Orpheo and Joel, we wanted really to create a very specific setting around the experience that people are coming in for. And these cards with very simple questions are really intentioned or designed for participants to come check in with themselves. It's sort of a moment to just scan. Mm-hmm. That alone shifts sort of the energy in terms of your attention, that this is a moment that's dedicated to you. It's a very simple method for people to just to shift that energy in the first instance even. And then we use these cards also post-experience for participants to reflect on the experience and kind of go deeper a little bit in terms of how, what reflections they have. And we've had over 20,000 people throughout even the little site, and what we have
20,000.
And through the big installation
who have had a Chromasonic immersion, which is sort of the light and sound immersion. We call it Chromasonic immersion, and
which we should kind of, I think, explain what Chromasonic refrequencing is for the listeners.
Yes.
Because
there's a scientific explanation.
A little bit
explain.
Elusive at this point.
Yes,
so.
it is elusive.
Yeah.
What are they talking about?
Yeah, how do we ground it? Yeah.
So Chromasonic is founded in our name, right? As chroma is color, and sonic sound, obviously, right? And so what we do is we link light and sound frequencies through algorithms. So we kind of create a fundamental connection between a waveform of light and a waveform of sound. And light and sound, of course, are not, one of them is electromagnetic, the other one is in a physical wave. They're not in the same energy field, but they're all waves. I guess the simplest way to explain it is that if you think about the colors of the rainbow, a red wave has a long wavelength, and then as you go through the spectrum, through the yellow, green, blue, violet, the waves get shorter, faster. So if you translate that to sound, Orpheo can tell you, then red would give you...
We work with a lot of different ways of representing specific pitches with specific colors. Yeah, we've found that certain colors feel much closer as you're experiencing them, and others feel a little bit more distant. It's a unique way to express this relationship, and everything is waveforms, right? Everything in existence is vibration. So this is just an interesting way to explore this relationship, and
it is, it's really so with the rainbow colors. So with the red being a long wave, if you translate that into a sound wave, you'd get a low tone, right? And then as you move through the spectrum with a shorter wave in light, you would get a higher frequency in sound. So if we do a really easy, simple one-to-one mapping, we'll get low sounds as we move, begin in the reds, and then as we move through the spectrum, we get higher pitches.
So you're allowing everybody to experience synesthesia.
Yeah, it's basically an artificial state of synesthesia. Yeah, and so the technology that we've developed, and we call the method, we call it Chromasonic refrequencing, and it basically takes in real time. It can take sound coming in, we can activate it with live instrumentation. It can do the frequency analysis, and then depending on how we map it specifically to the light spectrum, it'll generate a color in real time. So somebody can play a low tone and it'll generate red.
Really?
Yeah.
And somebody can generate a high tone, it'll create violet, right?
Oh, so these aren't pre-designed?
No, it's all analyzing in real time. And on the inverse, we can analyze a very specific color of light and convert that into a specific pitch.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool.
So in essence, we're kind of closing this loop between this relationship of sound converting into light and light into sound. And then we very intentionally create these different kinds of sessions that activate, have different intentionalities. Perhaps an experience that's really going to calm your nervous system with these very specific tonalities and color, or ones that will energize you and activate you. And this is something we continue to explore and experiment with.
Which ones do what? And how do what? And,
well, it is a bit subjective, but there are, but that said, like, reds, for example, are very intense. It's like you're very immersed in this red, and
I remember the reds feeling like they were like right here.
Yeah, and I love that intensity. Some people, it can be, it's a lot for them to have that kind of information. So we'll intentionally use red to like bring in that kind of intensity and that power.
The pink was my favorite for sure.
And then red is also these lower pitches generally, like as Johannes was mentioning, it's a slower wave. So we'll bring these slower, lower pitched waves that are also kind of grounding with this deep red.
Yeah, so reds can have a very visceral response, and then blue, and maybe it's because of the way we're built, with association, how we read the sky, we think or experience that as a color that is experienced as farther away, so it's more opening. So we can work with the different colors in different intensities, and then also in terms of lightness and darkness. So that's the other basic sort of chromosonic refrequencing factor, is that, darkness is silent, and as we brighten up, a volume of a sound goes up, or vice versa. So those are the very basic frameworks of chromosonic refrequencing, and we have built out our technology in ways that we're not doing that right now, but we're going to be very close to that in applying it, is that we are also able to take biometric feedback. So take, if it, at its most basic level, let's say heart rate or heart rate variability or any form of data really, and to be able to drive experience from that. So that data can drive color, that makes sound, that kind of feeds back into, so we can create these really interesting feedback loops.
Like hooking people up to like heart rate?
Yeah, like, or get everybody's biodata in a space and have that expressed and represented as sound and color, so you can actually hear and see what the biodata of this group together.
That's so cool.
And then you could take it a whole nother step. And if you had multiple spaces, we call the platform in Venice our satellite platform, which is intended for people to develop a practice around. But in those environments, if you had multiple, which is our intention, across the globe eventually, that can cross network and communicate with each other in real time, you could potentially send that biodata of one space, let's say in Austin, Texas, to another one in Copenhagen, and everybody in Copenhagen can experience the biodata of everybody in Austin, Texas, and vice versa, right? And now you're starting to have these communal experiences in a very non-narrative kind of way, right? Like now you're just like experiencing this group who you don't know as sound and light in real time, and they're experiencing you as a group. And, what kind of coherence does that start to create?
We would love to introduce you to our friend Adam Curry. He's a scientist around consciousness. He has a great app called Entangled, literally, where your consciousness interacts with the app. There's a lot of intersections between the work you're doing. Have you ever hooked anyone to like brain scans and seen how it affects their brain?
Yeah, absolutely.
What was the results?
So we did a 2-year study actually, in 2 phases with a neuroscientist, former neuroscientist from USC. So it was co-designed with my partner Harriet and the scientist from USC. Was based on the thousands of cards and reflections that people had left. That gave us an indication, just analyzing word choices and common threads within these reflections. And once you have like thousands of them, it becomes sort of statistically significant. We know this, I think, as artists, we know when these effects begin to happen, and we try to promote them to come out that way in our work. But the science part is a really important part, because it creates legibility around like what is actually happening. And we had the study that we did both a physiological and and psychological. And so it was 2-phase. It was quite remarkable in terms of the results, in terms of the sort of really statistically significant results that we can glean from a chromasonic immersion. So some of the really interesting things are, maybe not surprisingly so, but we've had like statistically significant reduction in stress, statistically significant reduction in anxiety, enhanced cognition, which is very interesting as a scientist. You can't fake that, actually.
Interesting.
And then so second phase of the study was with EEG, where subject were hooked up to EEG. And so we were able to get also additionally heart rate variability, brain activity, and all of those things. So the key indicators in general are that a chromasonic immersion has general benefits in terms of calming the nervous system, sort of broadly. We also did
the MEQ.
The MEQ, which is really interesting. The
mystical experience.
Cool.
It's a parallelized study. So we looked at a study that was made for mystical experience, where a group of people that were in a meditation retreat for 30 days, and they, I think it was 22%, or maybe about 20%.
Have what is called a full mystical experience.
Yeah.
And
at the meditation retreat.
Yeah, at the meditation retreat.
So 20% of the participants reported having had a full mystical experience. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, in a high-dose psilocybin therapeutic setting, in the clinical setting, I think it was 68% of participants reported full mystical experience, and 35-minute chromasonic immersion, 48% reported full mystical experience on their first go.
Did you call that an NEQ?
It's called
MEQ.
MEQ. It's a mystical experience quiz.
That's amazing. So the fact
so cool
that that's even a thing, doesn't that imply that a mystical experience is a verifiable fact and a phenomenon of the human condition?
Absolutely.
Yeah. But it's also an ineffable kind of engagement.
And it's a personal experience.
So talk about non-narrative.
It's anecdotal.
It's
right,
it's
but
something we're connected to.
It's funny. You can't measure what doesn't exist.
No. It's what I like to call the non-narrative intelligence.
Exactly. Yes. And that's the fascinating thing is me and Tanya like to, I think we spend too much time analyzing the mechanizations of plant medicine, like the healing protocols that it puts us in place, whether it's us or someone we're working with. And, one of the primary phenomenons, first off, it's predominantly color and vibration seem to be the tools, right? Which is sound, right? And sort of the quintessential psychedelic phenomenon, that we kind of have on these TV monitors is sort of starting with a construct, and it will then take that construct and bend it and change it. And we always think it's to re-imbue fluidity back into the mind, and so you don't have such fixed, intellectual constructs. So I'll give an example. In the early days of working with ayahuasca in Peru with the Shipibo tribe, I remember being shown, it was this image of this indigenous woman, this naked indigenous woman. It was sort of like a medium shot, like her bust, but she had her breasts out, right? And it was very sexualized image. And so I'm being shown this image. It's having a sexually evocative effect. And then what the medicine would then do is it would decay her before my eyes until she was an old woman, and then until she was a skeleton. And then it would reverse it all the way until she was a child, and then back until she was a mature woman, where she would be sexualized, to an older woman where she was desexualized, then to where she was decaying. And it's obviously it's trying to teach me that there was something wrong with the sexual, how I was sexually objectifying women instead of seeing the sacredness of them and the universal woman, and seeing them also as the child and also as the elder, right? So it was bending that. So do you think that the work you're doing is very much the same, in that you are using sound and color to just bring that fluidity back into the mind and sort of like bend these constructs these fixed set of constructs and ideas we have?
I think that's what's happening. That's what people are, participants are reflecting, and it's in the MEQ. By definition, right? It is subjective, but it is sort of a greater sense of connection, to the universe, a sense of unity, a sense of oneness,
a sense of awe, and ineffability, and connectedness.
Interestingly, also as part of the study, we're also measuring the reduction in fear of death. Actually, so people. who are, and this, we had this anecdotally through just in the cars, people would come out and, also people who have had, I remember I made a sculpture like 15 years ago. Somebody came out and said, I had a near-death experience in my life and I felt like I was going back to that space. And the first time I heard that was like, holy smokes. And I'm like, I'm sorry. It was actually that. And then as I learned more about like the empowering nature of near-death experiences, right? And how, what a profound kind of vehicle that is for people to,
it's like the ultimate.
It's the ultimate, right? Those people that have experienced that they were moved back to that space of the near-death experiences. And then in our more aged population that is coming in, we've had anecdotally also, they come out and say, I'm no longer afraid to die, so.
That's so beautiful.
And then the scientific study, we did a measure on that. There's a very specific metrics on that as well. And so there's also statistically significant reduction in fear of death. So those are all indicators that the rewarding part for us is that we kind of are creating, a knowledge around what we're doing, that what the work that we're doing can have like therapeutic
this is medicine.
Impact, right?
This is medicine.
It is medicine.
If you're healing the fear of death, how much suffering is from the fear of death?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's medicine.
Yes.
We had 2 psychedelic therapists on recently, and they were talking about palliative care, like end-of-life care using psilocybin. So it sounds like this could actually be an alternative to that where, maybe like building something that's like mobile, that where people could go in like care facilities, something like that to help with that. Because that's incredible that you're having that experience, giving that experience to people.
Yeah. And we really think a lot about also the preparation and integration around this being an active experience. It's something that we've spent a lot of time discussing as we start to create more of these satellite platforms in different cities for people to develop this practice. Having an environment for them to have some preparation to move more readily and openly into these more, ineffable, non-narrative type of experiences. And then as you come back, to have some support so that you can really develop a practice of merging these states that are activated into your day-to-day. So you can, create a practice of merging.
Because that's the same thing with psychedelics, right? It's not to be on psychedelics all the time.
No.
It's to teach, it shows you the way.
Point. It's an access point.
Johannes was saying that they have that. You have that in your downtown LA, right? Is where people go in and there's like a integration area or a place where they can kind of reflection.
A reflection space. Yeah. So we design all of our sites. So Satellite One in Venice is kind of the small set that you've been to, and that site also has a preparation integration space. So it's a pre and post space where you reflect first on, as you come in, and then post experience. And in our large site downtown that we just opened last month, so we have a preparation space before the main experience, which is called Chromasonic Field. And that's a darkened ambient space. This is not silent, but darkened ambient. And we do actually breath work, guided breath work in that for 3 minutes. It's just Orpheo introduced just a very basic form of box breath that our docents are doing there to basically have participants sort of settle in already into kind of a little bit of a different state. And then people move through the field. It's an expansive field of light and color linked together. And you can have, an experience of, you stay in there for 30, 40 minutes, and people are having similarly profound experiences to what they're having at Satellite as well. And then
which is more of a stationary experience versus the field where you're a little bit more actively walking through the space. You can be stationary.
You said they're having similar or the same?
Similar. Then we have the reflection space afterwards where we invite people to journal and or draw. And from those cards that people leave, again, we have, sometimes it kind of brings you to tears in terms of like what's actually happening.
This is so cool, guys.
And, these are profound, powerful experiences that can be accessed through, we talked about, it can be through breathwork, it can be through psychedelics, it can be through meditation. We can help people move into these expanded states. What we're trying to do is really to lower the barrier of entry to that so that it's really accessible. And what I mean by that is even a meditation practice, there's a high barrier of entry to meditation because it gets discipline,
a lot of time.
and then access to psychedelics in our culture. And it's also not right then and there,
accessible.
right?
It's not, there's a lot of taboo against it. There's a lot of fear.
And having the right kind of responsible people holding the space for medicine.
Yes, proper facilitators.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a lot. And that was going to be one of our questions, was if you tried, and you just answered it, but bringing quote unquote mindfulness practices and ceremonial technologies into this work to see if that amplified the rate of having a mystical experience. But it sounds like you're doing it.
That's
from
what we're
breathwork,
doing.
Meditative walking, even the movements medicine.
We're treating the Chromasonic immersion as the medicine.
Right.
So our framework,
that's brilliant.
Our framework around it is very similar to what it would be if you were using an entheogen or some sort of other kind of
genius. So you're
medicine.
essentially you're using the ceremonial container, but instead of the medicine, using art and technology. Wow. Genius. This is the fucking future.
No, it is. And that also being said, it is also highly integrative to come into this space after a psychedelic experience as well.
Right, because their field's so open.
There's a number of different ways that we can work with what we all know to be a really important kind of movement in terms of just expanding our sense of how we connect to one another, how we connect to presence, how we connect to our senses. If we have a greater awareness of how we can actually sense ourselves and sense each other, by extension, then we can enhance how we sense our environment. So the moonshot hope, is that through this work that we can just shift the way we are today and create a different tomorrow with the very basic methodology of connecting light and sound. So
and like through psychedelics, offering an environment for people to move into themselves truly as the conscious observer who is behind who I think that I consider myself to be, or who I project myself to be into the world. Like, who is listening to that inner voice? Who's listening to who's listening to that dialogue? And if we can create environments where all of a sudden, here I am, and I'm very aware and very sensitive to the essence of presence and coherence that is very much a part of that real-time experience you're having inside the environment.
Right.
You had mentioned something about that you're trying to make this like a practice. So are you having people that are repeating and coming and using it as a like daily or weekly or monthly practice?
So it's been really interesting at Satellite One in Venice. We're actually just now really introducing, and this is sort of happening in real time now, this week, next week, really in February now, we're formally introducing kind of very basic practice modalities around the Chromasonic immersion happening there. And prior to that, we have had kind of just one experience that we've, it's a pilot site for us in Venice. So it's a study site. That's where we've done the Neuroscientific study. We do all the sort of creative development. And we've also learned a lot by having, in that particular site, 7,000 people through in this little 6-seater. So you learn a lot. We were not narrating it as an experience that, not as that you should come, on a regular basis or anything like that. But there are people that are coming on a regular basis, and they say, "Yeah, this is way better than therapy," and it's less expensive. Yeah. So there's people that come as a sort of health maintenance practice or mindfulness practice, and are using it that way. And now we're really moving much more seriously and with much more intent into creating sessions and practice modalities. Even just this last week, we were having actually, since the fires, we're having free sessions at Satellite all the way through the end of this month. And we introduced breathwork at Satellite as well before going in. And it was really interesting to see and to observe how the writing after the experience, because of the breathwork beforehand, people are writing a lot more, and so they're engaging with their senses and with their feelings and their reflections in a more profound and deeper way. So all that to say is that practice modality, and I think Orpheo has been kind of a big proponent of that coming with a lot of the work that he's done over time. This needs to be a practice and will serve people best through a practice modality, doing it on a regular basis.
Okay.
I was just going to say that the space in Venice is really our first of the satellite sites, and our intention is that we will bring these spaces into various metropolitan environments. And this one is it's kind of our first, more or less, proof of concept beta site that fits a smaller group of people. But the idea is that we'll build bigger satellites that can fit up to 20 to 30 people inside.
Cool.
I think the 6-person one's pretty big.
Yeah.
It is. But if we can, we want to,
exactly.
we want to make it as accessible to as many folks as we can. So if we can make these spaces a little bit bigger, and then, future sites will have a real proper integration and preparation spaces, and also a place to build community in physical space. We're in an era, like a digital era, where so many people are engaging in zeros and ones, and talk about narrative. I mean, now we all have these personas that are projected, and it's also creating a lot of anxiety and depression for the younger generations that are, perhaps don't have what appears like some other unattainable level of materialism that some other children or younger teens have in some other environment, and it's making them feel very disconnected and very sad and very anxious, and the rates of teenage suicide is at a record high, and it has a lot to do with that. Anyways, that all to be said, I think a big part of the inspiration for us is also how, as artists, can we harness technology in a way that is going to bring people back together in physical space.
Orpheo,
right?
We say the same, like our mantra has become like, whatever we're doing, if the end goal is not bringing us back together in a physical space, like that's why our end goal is to have, that's how we first got connected, is to build, essentially medicine centers that are very in alignment with what you're doing.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is, even talking about community, you can see in the medicine communities in the West, the sense of community and the ceremonial practice, especially if they come from a secular place where they don't have church or anything. That becomes what people love so much, but now they have to work with medicine or a psychedelic every time just to be together, and that's not necessarily constructive.
No.
So you're removing the any sort of like volatility around addiction or abuse of these substances where people are just going for the community. You're creating a space where people can have a community centered not around substance use. It's not around going to the bar. It's not around a floating screen. We all know. I talk about ayahuasca experiences. Like my first ceremony, 10 years ago, it just flashed like a machine gun before my eyes. All the screens from my life, like literally like cell phones, movie theater, TV screens. And I was like, okay, I get it. Like I'm not living my life. My life is living me. But the point is that's genius. And we couldn't agree more in terms of bringing people back together and substituting sort of the entheogen as a sacrament. I mean, you are bypassing a lot of potential harm that is going to come as we integrate these medicines. And we're obviously very big proponents, but the brighter the light, the darker the shadow, that's, and that needs to be faced and discussed as well. Okay. What I gotta ask, what is the craziest story of healing or mystical experience you've heard from a testimony,
or for yourself,
yourselves in this, using.
Well, I mean, I will say it's just it's bringing me to mind right now is that somebody's water did break in satellite.
Yeah,
really?
Somebody was in there and she was just having a real profound experience and was like relaxed enough that her water.
It was our opening night of satellite.
The opening night.
And she's like, I need to go to the hospital.
And she had a beautiful baby within like 8 hours later.
And her husband like set up all these nice lights. He
was so inspired by the lights.
He got all these like nice colored LEDs for the hospital room.
That's awesome.
Vibed it out for her.
That is going to be the trippiest baby ever. Okay, so you made a woman give birth.
Yeah, I think the one that really struck me was also very early on at Satellite. There was actually a firefighter that came out after the experience, and I started chatting with him, and he's fighting fires all along the coast, and he had a very severe injury, a lung burn, where he had to be in a chemically induced coma for over, I think, almost a year. Actually.
Oh my God!
What he was saying was that he remembered, every moment of being in that coma, and he remembered it as the safest space that he had ever been in. When he was taken out of that coma, it took him like 3/4 of a year of therapy to just like find himself to be comfortable in this physical world again. And he came out of the space and he said when he was inside, he felt like he was back in the safe space of that coma.
Wow.
Yeah.
It is very womb-like.
It's very womb-like.
It's very much.
Womb-like.
Yeah.
And then, which is sort of like an appendage of that last question. Like, all right, you two, to be creating this shit, walking this walk, talking this talk, doing what you're doing. I mean, we know that our transcendental experiences have left us, have healed us, shaped us. Yeah. We spend most of our time trying to build bridges back to it and help people to get to those states because of how much they've healed us and transformed our lives, our relationship, our family. I mean, that is the very impetus of this entire show and this company is to build bridges. So what happened to you two? What did you do? How did you get there? You have to have a story of transcendence that put you on this
path. Or mystical experience of some kind.
Would you be willing to share? I know they're very personal, but I mean, gots to ask.
Gots to ask, yeah. Oh gosh. So I had a very complicated psychedelic experience in college, actually. Not knowing what I was ingesting or what I was being given. I thought I was smoking a joint. Whoa. And there was some other stuff laced into it, PCP. Actually.
PCP. I've heard people have had this experience. Yeah. Wow.
It was complicated because I didn't know what
was happening.
There was no setting for me. Actually.
Is that a psychedelic, PCP?
Yes. Yeah.
So,
shit. This is considered, yeah.
Guess it can be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I was definitely having hallucinations. So first of all, I, lost the concept of time. My heart started racing, the walls started pulsing, and I had a sort of a major panic, like a complete sort of collapse, actually. And I had a very close friend of mine that was holding the space for me, actually fortunate. That kind of helped me kind of remain in the space. And it was over a very long duration. It was like over 8, 10, 12 hours,
I think.
Oh my
God.
And then as it was coming, I was able to be on my own again. I, was floating above my bed, had all of these visions of, the Antichrist, and it was above a grave, and then kind of went down in a grave. And that was unexpected.
Wow.
Profound,
a sacrament of sorts.
A sacrament of sorts.
That's a American
unexpected sacrament.
And I remember the following day going to it was one of the art history classes or something like that, and looking at the slideshow of different paintings from 19th century paintings, and basically it was impressionist painting actually. So pixels and points of paint, and they started to float around and move. So it was kind of about this deconstruction of the image, and so it was very profound in the sense that at that moment in time, I realized, and then in studying painting, and when you're studying painting, right, and to actually represent let's say a physical space, it is actually all a composition of one color next to another color, next to another color, and it's all about those color relationships that are really just colors that then create the image. And so this sort of materiality of color that is, or the immateriality of color, composed in certain ways, creates the image, and that all broke down during that experience, that awareness that the image that we make is really just combinations of colors, seen in a very specific constellation, and that is the reality that we've physically experienced here. So that connected very much to the art making. So in that sense, it was a very profound and meaningful experience in terms of how I kind of see the world.
Right, sent you on that deconstructionist path as an artist. Yeah. Wow.
And for me, I've had a long-standing relationship with psychedelics since a very young age. I grew up in a kind of psychedelic environment. My dad was one of the merry pranksters.
Whoa!
So,
Are you kidding?
Yeah, so it was a mime, and he did a lot of, back in the 60s and 70s, did kind of these very psychedelic performances of mime with live music. So he was very much kind of a part of this experimentation that they were all doing with psychedelics around, Ken Kesey and that whole movement.
Can you share who the Merry Pranksters are for our audience that does not know? Because it's sort of like psychedelic royalty.
Yeah, so it was a gaggle of folks expressing themselves back in the 60s up around the Bay Area. Patriarchal figure behind the movement was the author Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and he started to get access to LSD. He was working in a psychiatric ward, and at that time the Sandoz LSD was not illegal. This was like early 60s, and he started getting access to this LSD, and then started experimenting with his friends. And this is also the space where the Grateful Dead started doing these, electric Kool-Aid acid tests. They were taking LSD and playing music, and then this whole kind of cultural movement was birthed out of that whole expression. And then they had a bus called the Further Bus, and they started to travel to different parts of the country and down in Mexico. And so
that's how the festival movement was birthed, right?
That whole movement was all integrated into this.
That's fascinating. All right, so your dad was
so he was part of that. I grew up around that. It's a lot of exploration in that space, in the liminal space. My wife and I have a very respected and deep practice around working with these medicines, and really with the intention of using them as a practice to merge the liminal with the material, and with reverence and grace, and to deepen that relationship with what I like to call, as I said earlier, the non-narrative intelligence, however you want to define that, that ineffable, the great mystery. There's an intelligence there, and it's non-narrative. It is non-dual. When you go into these deep spaces with these medicines, which really are sacraments in that way, they do give you access to this intelligence. It's easy to want to, use them to just kind of, this is God, I'm going to God, and how do I just stay in God? Something my wife and I discuss a lot is, how do you merge that kind of state of divinity with the material dualistic world that's here for us to experience? It's not something to run away from. It's something to celebrate. We're all 9 billion of us are experiencing it, and the suffering and the love and all of it. It's here to be celebrated. So the practice is to merge it, and through that merger becomes an authentic expression of faith in the unknowable. And through that faith, we start to deepen that relationship with that intelligence, and that intelligence can inform us in real time, and we can trust the emergence of that intelligence to move before us and allow things to create themselves as they do, and I think that that's really relevant. And for me, I look at my life, it's very magical in that way. And even how we got to meet, it was our mutual friend who is an astronomer at the school up in Ojai. They were taking the top part of the observatory at the school. They were rebuilding it, and they were taking the dome off, and I was hiking up the trail, and I just that morning was like, and I've been thinking about these immersive spaces, and not knowing really what that would look like, and where you're moving the performer. And then I just had this flash. I'm like, what are they doing with that dome? I'm going to call them and see if I can get the dome on my property. And like, this will be the start. And so, I call him and I start he's like, yeah, we'll come. He's like, if you can helicopter it off the property, because if you take this thing apart, you're never putting it back together. You can helicopter it off the property, it's yours. That never ended up happening, but that's what sparked this conversation about this vision, of like sound and light in space. And that's when he connected Joel and I with Johannes. And he's like, you need to meet Johannes and his partner Harriet, and they have this practice, and he makes these amazing spaces. Yeah. And then we were on a blind date, and like that, here we are several years later, and it's these little moments that just come and they are emergent. Mm-hmm. And my practice is to just have faith in them, and to go from the being into the doing and into the having, instead of doing to have and then to be. So so that's the practice. And to bring it back to Chromasonic, it's like, how can we activate that relationship? How can we create these kind of sacraments without necessarily having to take a medicine, which is deeply powerful. But what happens when we use sound and light, which is around us, and activate them in very intentional ways to bring that relationship together? I think that's extremely powerful.
It is the convergence of the immaterial and the material. The immaterial being light.
Yeah.
And how that enters, our physical selves, and sound as a physical mechanical wave, the haptic nature, the felt nature of sound. When we link those and join those and unite those together, we do get that convergence of the physical and the material. That's where that liminal space kind of resides.
Amazing. We heard some quote the other day. It was like, service is what prayer looks like when it gets off its knees and starts walking around. And that's what you're doing.
Is there anything else that you would like people to know about Chromasonic, or the work that you're doing, or
how they can find
anything
you?
Else?
Yeah, I think, right now we're really focused on, we opened a Chromasonic field downtown in the downtown LA Arts District, and that experience is one where people coming in can really get a sense of what a Chromasonic immersion is like. It is really an experience that is done in community with others, and you can bring your family, you can come with friends, you can come alone, of course, as well, but you will be aware of others in that space with you. So it's a very beautiful communal experience. The way we work in that space is with a very specific technique of also creating an appearance of the elasticization of space. So, space kind of feels like it's expanding and contracting, and others in the space appear and disappear. So it becomes a fundamental human experience. We experience our connection to others somehow through the loss of the awareness of others and then the return of them as well. So it can be quite a profound experience as well. So Chromasonic field is a wonderful place to get to know what the work is about. You don't need to know anything about anything to be able to benefactor or to be a benefactor of the work. And if you want to go deeper, you come to Satellite One in Venice.
Yeah, and we also are really honoring and treating the space that Chromasonic field is in downtown also as like a cultural hub. It's an amazing part of town in the Arts District. Beautiful building. We have this beautiful reflection space that folks get to go into after having the active experience of being in the field. And while that's also a beautiful exchange just on a regular scheduled day, we are going to start to do special programming in that space where we're going to have guest musicians come, and after you've gone through the experience, you get to walk into the reflection space and have a beautiful kind of 45-minute sonic journey with various different unique musicians that we all have good relationships with, or perhaps a Dharma talk, or perhaps a little breath work, or just unique ways to engage with the space and to engage community and have people engage in physical space and have an opportunity for them to reflect and share with each other, but not necessarily with words, but just with presence and engagement. So we are going to be doing different cultural engagements over these coming months, every few weeks as a special added part of the experience.
We really think of it as a cultural hub where we can activate together in community with others. Chromasonic is really deeply engaged in sort of the evolving field of what's called Neuro-arts. It's really the research field of how the arts affect us and how the arts affect our health. And so there's a large body of research that's evolving right now in terms of how it's everything from better designed spaces to, if you're painting or if you're playing music or if you're listening to music or if you're dancing or you're watching somebody dance. There's a lot of research going on right now around the health benefits of partaking in that.
Can you share so far what the research is saying about what kind of art produces what types of states of consciousness, both positive and negative?
Or is it just any kind of art?
So it's a broad. It's the arts in general, and so we had the opportunity to do an installation earlier last year in partnership with Google at the Milan Design Fair with Ivy Ross, who's the head of Google Hardware Design, who is a big proponent of the field of Neuro-arts, and she co-authored a book with Susan Maximin, who's a neuroscientist from the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. So there are a lot of neuroscientists working on documenting the health benefits of art experiences. Broadly speaking, the arts, literally anything to do with art is good for you. It is good for your health. It's good for your mental health. It extends life. So the work that we're doing specifically is also amplified by the sort of the evolving knowledge that this type of work is really good for you. And so we're just supporting the fact that, that the arts in general need to be supported. And I think there's an opportunity now because of the science coming into this as well now that makes the purpose of the arts like more legible for a broader public in general, and also how funding and support can be kind of brought into that space, because there are health benefits and the science is showing that. So that's
they need to take that research and show it to the school systems so they can start funding art. And I just can't, the idea that they take art out of school, art was like the fundamental thing for me in
Yeah, same.
school.
Yeah.
Music
Yeah.
classes, art classes. Like
Yeah.
I didn't do performing arts, but I mean, it's crucial to have that in there. So maybe this will help nudge them in the right direction.
Yeah, our imaginations shape the world, right?
Yes.
So you gotta water that plant, right?
Yes.
All right, boys.
All right.
Yo, you're both amazing.
Do you want to plug where they can find you?
Yeah.
Just chromosonic.com?
Yes, chromosonic.com. You can chromosonic.com as well as chromosonicfield.com. But our main site is chromosonic.com. You can get all the information. You can link into both sites. And
then Instagram at Chromosonic.
Yeah.
And that's CHROMASONIC. Chromosonic. Yeah.
We'll put the links down below.
Put the links. Boys, we feel very kindred spirits with you both and
Thank
your
you so much
entire
for
team.
coming.
And
Yes.
just here to support you, to the bitter end, baby.
Yeah.
right.
We appreciate you guys so much.
So much.
Really. Thank you for your support.
Really.
All
Really
ships rise
appreciate it.
together. Yeah,
Yes.
same intention.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, gang. If you hung with us this long, please subscribe, like, rate, comment. It helps us out a lot. You might have heard us say this once or twice by now, but we are a heavily censored show. A lot of the topics and the things we're covering really fuck up the algorithm for us. But so please, anything you can do to support, send this episode to your grandmother, whatever. It all helps. All right.
And also go check out Chromosonic and these guys and the amazing work that their team is doing at chromosonic.com.
Yeah. Be well. Take care of each other. Bye.
Bye.